With over 100 campaigns to choose from in Warhammer 3, it can be hard to tell your bangers from your clangers. So today, let's go over the worst campaign for every faction. Also, thanks to Manta Sleep for sponsoring the video, more on them later. I think anyone that has played as the Beastmen knows that none of them are really that bad. As a race, they are one of the strongest in the entire game, so a lord with no effects whatsoever is still going to be pretty strong. So instead, I'm going to choose the worst lord based on their lackluster dedication to the bit, and that is Ogre. This guy is on the Beastmen roster and is undoubtedly a Beastman, but for some reason he's obsessed with Chaos Spawn. They have this entire roster for him to fawn over, and instead he chooses a unit from the Warriors of Chaos, and a pretty mid one at that. If you're not aware, Chaos Spawn as units are kinda bad. They have low armor piercing damage, no real survivability outside of Unbreakable, and they're pretty slow, especially when compared to the rest of the Beastmen offerings. When you have access to Minotaurs, there is simply no reason to ever choose Chaos Spawn, and so playing as Ogre is just shooting yourself in the foot for no good reason. Like, yeah, he makes them better, but wouldn't you rather those improvements went to units that were already strong rather than something that's pretty mid? Like I said, he's still a very strong faction, but his focus sucks, so he's gonna have to be the worst. I got an important question for you. How dark is the room where you sleep? Do you keep a nightlight on to scare away the monsters? Maybe you fall asleep binge watching House MD, chaining together as many no-no words as possible in a single sentence. Well, I'm sorry to say, but if you do either of these things, you're gonna die. Okay, well, technically, even if you don't do all these things, you're gonna die anyway because, you know, mortality, but sleeping in a room with even a small amount of light is still really bad for you. You can think of sleep like a tier list. You want this S tier super deep sleep to get your brain the best rest possible, but any light that comes in grabs a 2x4 and oh no you don't pushes you back down the rankings. This means the sleep you're getting is going to be less restful, and this increases your risk of depression, obesity, and even chronic illness. You can be getting 8, 10, even 12 hours of sleep, but if the room you're sleeping in isn't dark enough, you can still be missing out on rest that you really need. And that is why I'm oh so glad to have my Manta Sleep mask, because with this thing, it doesn't matter how light the room is, none of it is reaching my eyes. This thing is extremely adjustable, so I've got it perfectly fitted to my giant melon, and it sits securely on my face all night long no matter how much I roll around. That means from the moment I slip it down to the moment I slide it up in the morning, I'm getting 100% complete and total darkness, and I can say that my sleep quality has definitely been loads better. Add on the fact that this thing is extremely comfortable and puts no pressure on my actual eyes, and I really have never slept better. So if you want to join me in getting the best night's sleep possible, click the link in the description or head on over to mantasleep.com and pick up one for yourself. And while you're there, be sure to use code DAMNERS for 10% off your purchase. A huge thank you to Manta for sponsoring the video and continuing to support the channel, and now, back to the list. Bretonnia is a weird one because I really do believe that Luen has the worst effects of the lords and Fate is the worst in battle, but Alberic somehow manages to be so mid in both categories that he pushes them both out of the way to secure himself a spot in last place. His recruitment buffs for all knights are pretty good, but his army focusing on the lower tier units of the roster makes him scale horribly into the late game. Add on to that he's marginally better in combat than a generic lord, and he doesn't really bring anything to the table that would tempt me to play him. And when you consider that his starting location is in Lustria rather than the safe and bountiful shores of Bretonnia, he really is the worst option when choosing to play as the French. There is just no reason to pick him over the others unless you like a really bad faction, buffs for weak units, and a lord that is barely a step above something that the rest can recruit from turn 1. The Chaos Dwarfs are of course one of the strongest races in the game, and no matter what lord you pick, that's going to be true. But I believe Zatan is the worst of the lots, but that being said, it's pretty damn close. Ashtagoth probably has worse effects with his focus on influence and bull centaurs, but Zatan starts in a very rough location and himself is the weakest of the legendary lords, since he's the only one without any spells. The cheaper recruitment for artillery does rock, as does the extra casualties captured, but more convoys is only useful in the early game since all caravans suck, once armies are big enough to attack them. Can you still rule the world as Zatan? Absolutely. However, I still think it is a little bit easier to do as the other two lords, so he's just about getting a spot on the list. For the Demons of Chaos, we have the classic choice of Daniel. CA, please give the demons something, or at least do them the decency of lending them down by the river. The Dark Elves, despite how many times people disagree in the comments, are really one of the worst races in the game in terms of feeling up to date and powerful. But one thing I can't fault is that their legendary lords are quite similar in terms of power level. Most of them have a fun little gimmick that keeps them at about the same power level as the rest, with the exception of the OG Malekith, the Mother Kisser. He has no Slaanesh corruption, no Blood Knights, no Black Ark spam, no demonic possession, no monster pens, no dick, and no balls. All he has is the ability to make better alliances with other Dark Elves, and even that is shaky since these lads love a good backstab. He simply doesn't do anything better than the others, so by default he has to be the worst. Honestly, his best effect is extra loyalty for new recruits, and that's only because he gets to circumvent what I think is one of the most annoying and badly implemented mechanics in the game. This guy should be the Witch King, who can bring all other Druki to heal, but right now he's the Bitch King, who, at best, can only get his own mother to kneel. Should I leave that in? I really don't know. Another case of all of these lords are pretty great since the dwarves are just so strong that it's hard for them not to be. However, if you're going to pick a dwarf for the worst campaign, you have to go with Belegar. All of the others have such an easier time and can really do whatever they want, but poor Belegar is trapped in the race for 8 peaks and he's by far the most penalised. Until he captures 8 peaks, he suffers massive upkeep penalties, and for a faction as expensive as the dwarves, that means he can manage 1 stack of weak units at the most with the settlements he captures along the way. With that stack, he also needs to cross the top of the Badlands, which is no mean feat these days, with the ogres, greenskins and more roaming around. Once there, he needs to besiege 8 peaks, which perpetually has at least a stack sitting on it, and the dwarves low-key suck at attacking sieges, especially in the early game. And what is his reward for going through these 12 labours of Belegarcules? You gain control of 8 peaks. I mean, inside of it you have a few landmarks that give you some okay buffs, but you still need to spend gold and build that yourself. You get this giant penalty, and the only reward you have for overcoming such a task is you get to play a normal campaign afterwards without the penalties. It might just be me, but I feel like you should be getting a little bit more than that. Unfortunately for Volkmar, he's in a race that has 4 absolute banger campaigns with fun, deep mechanics in their own right, and he just kinda doesn't. Like, he's not terrible, in fact I don't even think he's bad, but he's just fine. When your other options are the Elect Accounts guy, Welcome to Estalia, Colonization Simulator, and Modern Warfare Warhammer 3, you have to do a lot better than fine for me to bother. The Books of Nagash as an order mechanic are genuinely a cool idea, and I like the focus on the more religious aspect of the Empire, but his other effects are just ass. We're once again spending all of our time making bad units decent when we could be making great units even greater. Add on to that, he starts in the desert with no friends and no shortage of enemies, and he's just a bad time all round. And lastly, you have to play as a bald guy. And who wants that? Grand Cathay was an extremely easy pick, and it's not even particularly close. Sure, all the Cathay lords are strong in combat with the dragon transformations and dragons, but Zhao Ming has such awful effects that I can't not pick him. He has a major focus on caravans, and caravans suck. Like, outside of the first turn and being extremely lucky, they are quite possibly the biggest waste of gold in the game. You are just sending weak armies to the wolves with no hope of making it to the other side. Awful, awful, awful mechanic that desperately needs a rework, and he focuses almost entirely on that. But worry not, he also brings buffs melee units and ogre mercenaries. What's that? The Cathay roster has a ton of powerful non-melee units that get nothing, and ogre mercenaries are niche as hell and unreliable? Huh. Yeah, he really has nothing. Add on, he has a pretty bad starting location and ends up taking unpleasant territory fairly early, and he's simply never the move. If you want to play in Cathay, play Meow. If you want deeper mechanics and a change of scenery, Yuan or Kitty Cat. Zhao just has no reason to play him other than pain. As much as I want to pick Gorbad for the Greenskins and be a little bitch, I know in my heart that he's not actually the worst. No, that honour goes to Azhag, and the reasons are all fold. First off, his effects, both Lord and Faction, are trash. So yeah, maybe he can be pals with Vlad, but all that really does is secure a single border. And that's assuming Vlad even survives to be friends. You then focus on the Law of Death, when the Law of the Big War is right there and better in every way. Plus, Azhag himself is a Law of Death practitioner, and on the Greenskin scale of melee battlers, sits firmly in the middle. You're trapped at the top of the Old World Mountains, so it's nothing but dwarves to the south, Chaos Dwarfs to the east, Chaos to the north, and Kislev to the west. There are no potential tribal confederations in sight, so your expansion is slow and painful for a very long time. Honestly, Azhag is another of those lords that really isn't that bad. It's just that most of the other Greenskins are so comedically overpowered that he just looks weak in comparison. He has a fairly standard if underwhelming campaign, but compared to the Destroyers of Worlds you also have the choice of, he's pretty mid. I was honestly pretty shocked that High Elf Batman ended up getting the spot, but the High Elves are pretty solid all round. I did consider Teclis, but the potential spell power is just so insane, so it had to be Eltharion, and that's mainly due to his dual start. Now I know that you can abandon Ulthuan and focus on the Badlands, but my retort is, that sucks. If you do this, you get no benefit from the miss, and are playing as a High Elf with no connection to Ulthuan, which just doesn't feel right unless we're talking about Imrik. However, if you keep Ulthuan, then you have no money and have to fight a campaign on 2 fronts, which also sucks. Add on to that, the best way to get resources needed to upgrade Athol Tamara is by raising Greenskin settlements, and you can't exactly do that if you abandon Ulthuan and his campaign is simply confused. Alongside all of this, he also focuses on early game units, which is nice since that's all you'll be able to afford, but regardless ignores the other 90% of the roster you should hopefully be using for the majority of the game. It is a great campaign thematically, but personally, I just feel they over-engineered this one and it has not stood the test of time. Look, picking the worst Khorne Lord is like picking the least stinky gamer. Some might be more pungent than others, but they're all going to have a whiff of the stank to them. But if I really had to pick, then Skarbrand is probably the one. I know he's ridiculously powerful with all his Bloodhost buffs, abilities healing for our lands and surplus of skulls, but Skulltaker can literally break the balance of the game and Arbol can teleport around the map doing his evil thing, all the while buffing mortal units which, let's be honest, are better than demons since they don't disintegrate when they get nervous. Skarbrand is very, very strong, but since he has a relatively normal power trip compared to the other two server admins, he's going to have to get the spot. Not bad by any means, but probably as hard as it gets when it comes to Khorne. Another easy pick because it always has been and likely always will be Kastaltin. As much as I despise Mama Stanky, and believe me, I do, Kastaltin has basically nothing going for him. His only mechanic is taking part in the political race against Catherine, and I don't know about you, but if I have the choice between a boss bitch ice witch or an old religious dude, I think I know who I'm going to pick. Mechanics aside, the rest of his abilities are pretty ass, focusing once again on the lower tier units of the roster that you'll want to phase out as soon as you possibly can. He himself is also weak in combat, so can't even carry your armies full of mildly buffed weaker units, and his location is insanely tough, with the full force of Norsca and Azazel on your doorstep from turn 1, not to mention Throt the Unclean, Dryka, and more. It's just rough all around for Kastaltin, and honestly for a zealot like him, I'd wish nothing less. You know, after a bunch of races where I was having to do a lot of comparing and contrasting, it's a relief to have Nakai here waiting for me. This guy has been the worst Lizardmen Lord in the game and one of the worst lords in the entire game for a very long time, and nothing short of a full-scale, pun intended, rework is going to fix that. Nakai is the only Lizardmen Horde faction and has the worst Horde in the game, and there is no shortage of reasons why. First of all, he has to pay upkeep, and for a roster like the Lizardmen, it ain't cheap. On top of this, his ability to make money is reliant on his vassal income, aka very low and very unreliable. His other armies can also not build hordes, so have to rely on his recruitment either by following him around or making use of overpriced, lengthy, global recruitment. And outside of this, he has essentially no real mechanics. Now sure, he can build shrines for some forgettable and mid-sell upgrades, but aside from that, he's just a big lizard chud. Also, his starting location is ass, but honestly, that's the least of his worries. Once again, this is a race where all lords are pretty strong because the shiny new Norscan bones are just that strong. However, if I was to pick one lord, it would have to be the Wanderer, and it is for one very simple reason. His unique mechanic is Seafang, and his ability to teleport himself and allies around the campaign map. It's really cool, but it's also really cool when you confederate him and can just use it anyway. You can get 90% of the experience of playing as Wulfric by playing as Throg and getting a tribal confederation, which really is not that hard. The rest of his effects are minor marauder buffs with some extra cash from raiding, and that's it. Short and sweet, but Wulfric is kinda a cosmetic option when it comes to Norsca. This one really hurts because I love Epidemius. In fact, he's probably my favourite of the Nurgle lords. If it was up to me, based purely on how well they embody my perception of Nurgle, it would 100% be Tamokan, because that lad is a warrior of chaos if I've ever seen one. However, Epidemius is factually the worst because he really doesn't bring enough to the table. The Tallyman's ability is cool, and spreading plagues to as many enemies as possible is a really fun gameplay loop, but Kugath plague mogs him with blessed symptoms and reduced costs no problem. Tamo-chan Uwu may not be Nurgle, but he's still so damn strong that it really doesn't matter. Epi is epic, but sadly, he's the loser by default. The Ogres are another race where all of their lords are so strong because the base mechanics do 90% of the work for them. But amidst the individual faction mechanics, Skrag undoubtedly falls behind. His mechanic makes him the master of meat and offering it to the Great Maw. The rewards he gets for this are fine, but when compared to the other two, there's simply not enough. Goldfriend is obviously an unstoppable force of nature who is basically impossible to lose as, and Greases can throw an unending pile of gold at his problems until he has none. No amount of Schmeat can touch that, and so Skrag has to be the worst. Whilst the Skaven undoubtedly have some of the strongest lords in the game, they also have some less than powerful options, and I really do think Skrog is the weakest. For starters, he's a wannabe Nurgling with all of these buffs and bonuses for plagues, and no way to customize them like the rest of the plague-based campaigns. All you have is the Pestilence scheme, which is fine, but nothing all that exciting or impactful. Outside of the Plague focus, he really doesn't have much else. His army gets cheaper upkeep for Plague units, which are fine, and spreads more Skaven corruption, which is fine part 2. He puts all of his eggs into a Plague basket, but he doesn't realise that his basket has a giant gaping hole in it, so he has nothing. Does this analogy work? I can't tell. For some reason, I thought Slaanesh was going to be real tough because their 2 lords are super strong, but then I remembered, Nikari exists. Now, does he have the worst mechanic in the entire game? No. However, compared to the other 2, is this mechanic extremely convoluted and much slower to get to the world domination bit? Yes, and it's not even close. Look, I love seduction as much as the next gamer, but this implementation is such a fast to get going to any reasonable degree that it almost always is far easier to just take lands for yourself and forfeit the potential battle. In theory, I like it, but in practice, it is just awful, and I'm sick of pretending it's not. And his entire faction and almost all of his effects revolve around it, so if it's awful, well, too bad, you get nothing else. Add on he starts on Ulthuan with no chance to warm up before going to war with literally every elf in the world, and Nikari is just a chore to play. Can I just say all the Tomb Kings? Like, it is 100% Cathay, but can it just be all of them, because Jesus, these guys need an update. Their effects are so bare bones it actually feels like an intentional decision to go with their appearance. Anyway, Cathay has the worst location of all the Tomb Kings, and it's not even slightly close. Yes, he can take mountain settlements, and no, he doesn't necessarily need to be in the desert, but it might help. He has no access to pyramids that the rest do, and is instead condemned to Dark Elf Hell for the price of having too much swag. His effects are also an actual nothing burger. Woo, cool magic and crafting, but yeah, there's not even anything here to complain about because it's just nothing. Justice for Tomb Kings in the end times? Trust. I mean, it has to be Kairos, and it's not really anything to do with him. Changeling is literally a server admin with a full suite of console commands, and no real way to lose outside of blatant stupidity, so of course Kairos, a fairly normal lord, is going to be worse. Also, his unique mechanic being moving around the winds of magic is cheeks. Cool in concept, but in practice, oh my god, it is so boring. I really hate Kairos, so this one feels pretty good, but in reality, he's probably just below good, but on this list, that makes him the worst. Well, this is one of the few entries I don't even have to think about. First of all, let me channel my inner Damian Lee and say, she doesn't even go here! And by that I mean, she's not a vampirate. She is for sure a pirate, but she's not a vampire. Now I know what you're thinking, neither is Silostra, but at least she's a ghost, I mean that's undead adjacent. But Aranessa is just a whole-ass mortal with fish for body parts. Fraud check aside, her effects are also cheeks. Buffs for sacking, raising and finding treasure maps is very piratey, I'll give you that, but not actually all that useful in the campaign. Her army buffs for Sartosan units are as unique as the units, but sadly, stop being useful just as fast. But that leadership aura? That's pretty tough, I can't deny. I never want to play as her, the other 3 are so much better at hers, and I hope she gets moved to her own faction like Daniel. Look, I love Necromancer Grandpa as much as the next undead fanatic, but let's be honest guys, this guy kinda sucks. His buffs with the various forces of chaos would be more useful if he started anywhere near any of them, because where he is, they offer him nothing. The extra XP for Necromancers is tight, as is the slightly cheaper Raising the Dead, but let's not beat around the bush and dive into the coochie of this guy. He has his boy toy Krell, but this lad is still a summon after all these years. Make him a legendary hero for the love of God. At least then we can have a more interesting skill tree for them both. As a vampire stan, I will say that being the worst vampire count just means you are the 5th best lord in the entire game, but sadly that title does fall to Heinrich. Geography is really one of those factors that can make or break a faction, and for Festus, it absolutely nukes him from orbit. Every single other Warrior of Chaos starts in a location where they can immediately secure a vassal and some passive income and aid in whatever wars they end up getting involved in. Festus, however, starts in the middle of the Empire, and you were given naught but a pat on the ass before you are sent out to your inevitable doom. You have no chance to create any vassals and just have to get straight into things with Karl just a short hop, skip and a jump to the south, and you know he's going to hunt you down. Add on the fact that you have access to plague crafting, but no real way to quickly earn infections, and this is a campaign that feels extremely half-baked when compared to the rest. He's a cool lord, and I do love his vibe, but it is undeniable that he is at a massive disadvantage when compared to the rest. And lastly, we have Dryka, and could it really be anyone else? The Wood Elves are so damn strong, and even with that power and her forest spirits, Dryka is just hard. You don't start with the Oak of Ages, and taking it back is going to be tough no matter how you go about it. Add on to that, she nerfs all elf units, which are undoubtedly some of the strongest units in the roster, and she's given a huge number of penalties compared to the rest. I get that that is the point, but it doesn't make her any easier, and without a doubt, the worst Wood Elf campaign in the game. But if you instead want to know the best mods that hit the workshop in the month of July, check out this video for just that.